Welcome to the Lust is Boring podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, you might be a little intrigued by the title, Lust is Boring. Seems like a bit of a paradox, like, well, no, lust is actually pretty exciting. I think what we're really after in life is not lust, which is the reduction of a human person to their sexual value. Because when we see God's plan for human love, lust is what looks boring. Because lust is not sexual intimacy. Lust is not passion. Lust is not arousal. Lust, as I said, is the reduction of a person merely to their sexual value. And the temptation to do this isn't just something that guys go through. A lot of times there's this stigma, this shame. If any girl is experiencing temptations, addictions, pornography, whatever, she's thinking, okay, what's wrong with me? You know, I don't even sin in a feminine way. It should be a guy problem. And it kind of drives her into this cycle of shame and isolation. Today we have a guest on the show that's going to kind of break that cycle. People say, no, look, this isn't just a guy issue. If you're a woman out there, you're struggling with these kinds of things, stay tuned, listen to her testimony. If you're a guy tuning in, listen as well. I think it's really helpful to hear some of the strategies that women can use to find liberation can be effective for guys wrestling with the same stuff as well. Before we get rolling, I do want to thank a new sponsor that's come alongside the mission here at Lust is Boring podcast, Canopy. Canopy is a really neat app. Kind of a filter that you can use for your phone, your kids' phones, computers, devices. And what this will do is not only block porn sites, which is relatively easy for a filter to do, it has this artificial intelligence thing that will block it as you scan. Because let's say you block all the porn websites. Well, there's lots of stuff that isn't so good on other sites or apps. Well, as you scroll through, within milliseconds, it's able to detect immodest imagery and just block that out. It works on apps like TikTok, on Discord, things like that. And so if you want to try this for a month for free, if you're a parent, you want to keep your kids safe online, just go to their website, which is canopy.us. And then if you add /15 off, that'll take you to our landing page. And I'll put that in the link in the show notes. And you'll get 15% off for lifetime using this. And it's a really inexpensive little thing that you can install as an app on your kid's phone. But man, I remember Matt Fradd once saying that you used to have to spend time, money, and effort to go see porn. And now, unfortunately, we're kind of in a place in culture where you've got to spend time, money, and effort not to see pornography. And so, thankfully, Canopy doesn't cost a lot of money, and you can try it for a month for free. But check this thing out. It's really great. Able to block a lot of this junk to keep your life porn-free. Also, another promotion we got going on right now. As we mentioned last episode, my new book on gender just came out. Honestly, I've never spent so much time researching a book. In the endnotes, we've got more than 1,000 references of peer-reviewed journals. And so if you're struggling with this question, hey, I got a friend who identifies as trans. Should I use their preferred pronoun? You know, what if my daughter is experiencing gender dysphoria? Or, you know, is it true that, you know, some people have an intersex brain? What's the science behind all that stuff? All the answers are in this book. So whether you're in a gender studies program in college, you want to be able to go toe-to-toe with your professor on these issues, or whether you experience gender dysphoria, might want to know what God's plan for love is and life for you, this book goes into this with a lot of charity and a lot of clarity. And so if you want one, you can go to chastity.com. And they're there already available as an ebook or an audiobook. You can also pre-order the physical book, or if you're not already part of our Patreon community, if you want to become a member of that community and support this program at $20 or more, we'll just send you the book for free. Just go to patreon.com/Jason Everett. So that's it in terms of sponsorship notes and products. Do want to give you a little update. We just got back from Mexico City on an unbelievable pilgrimage for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where people travel literally hundreds of miles on foot on pilgrimage to visit Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so we got to celebrate the feast day there, which was incredible. Now, we also were able to visit a nursing home, which is amazing. And then also, I think the highlight of the trip was Girls Town. This is like a school/orphanage on the outskirts of Mexico City that houses 3,000 of the poorest of the poor girls in Mexico. These amazing nuns, I think they're from Korea, go to the worst parts of Mexico. I mean, we're talking like drug cartel infested, sex trafficking, violent, poverty-stricken areas. And these nuns just go right in there and they look for the poorest families and they recruit the girls and the boys saying, look, we'll take one kid from your family and we'll give you 5 years of free education and spiritual formation. And so the parents will send one kid off, and man, they get formed in these little convents and seminaries, not necessarily for the religious life, but the formation they get is like that. And so we came down and we're told, okay, the priest said, hey, if you want, you guys can speak to the girls here. We'll let you have the older girls, 15, 16, 17, 18, and some of your team members can speak to the younger ones. And so I get in there and these girls come out, 16, 17, 18 years old. Most of them have experienced sexual trauma and abuse, all kinds of stuff. And they walk in, and I'm looking, I'm like, wait a minute, I thought we had the 17, 18-year-olds. These girls, like they're 11 or 12 years old, but these were the 16, 17, 18-year-olds coming from broken family, having been sexually abused, and they looked like kids. And what it was is the priest there, Father Dan Leary, does these Eucharistic healing sessions with these girls. And the restorative power of the Blessed Sacrament in these girls' lives is inconceivable. I mean, I can tell from 25 years doing chastity talks, sin ages your soul. It just does. I mean, you see it in the faces of some of these American high school kids, or you walk in and like, God bless them, but they're 14, but they look like they're 28 and they've already lived through like 3 or 4 years of sorority and frat life, and they're like, don't even have a driver's license. Then you go down there and you see the innocence of these kids, the joy in their smiles. The only place I've ever seen anything like it, honestly, is at a cloistered convent. And so if you want to give and support the mission they're doing at the World Mission of Families, or the World Villages of Children is what it's called, World Villages of Children. I'll put a link down in the show notes if you want to make a little donation to them at Christmas time. 60 of the girls are not able to go home for Christmas because either they couldn't afford a bus ticket, $35, or home is just not a safe place to be this Christmas. And so they're going to stay there kind of at this orphanage school. So if you wanted to help bless them, little Christmas presents, you can donate at the link below. But enough news and announcements. Next time we have a pilgrimage, it's going to be World Youth Day. We'll have updates on that as we come out with that soon. If you guys want to join us to go to Portugal and Spain for that one. Now, today's show, Breanne Demarco, this is a woman who spent 13 years in international ministry. She grew up at the Diocese of Austin, did some missionary work in 13 different countries, did some youth ministry in the United States as well. Was also campus minister at Texas State University. Most recently, and more importantly, she got married, has 2 beautiful children, and is here today to share her testimony with us on the subject discussed earlier. So, Breanne, thank you for being with us on the show today.
It's awesome to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, what brought you to do all these 13 different countries of missionary work that I'd mentioned in the bio? Like, how did you were able to do all that?
Oh gosh, I mean, the Lord called me in the midst of a very crazy time of my life as well. He called me as I was, freshly out of rehab, trying to figure out this whole pornography thing, trying to stay sober in that regard. Mm-hmm. And the Lord called me into foreign missions. And I just remember thinking, like, there's no way, God, you're calling me to, like, me of all people. I clearly have this problem. I've been struggling with this thing. Why would I be called to go and talk to other people about you, Lord? Like, why would you do that? And he was very persistent and very relentless in his call. And so eventually I had to give into that despite feeling terribly unqualified. The Lord was like, no, I want you. I want you to carry this message. And I did. And it was so blessed and so fruitful. I think because of that faithfulness and that surrender to his will, he really carried me through that. And it was just a very beautiful time. So the preaching the gospel is something that's at my heart, but in a way that's authentic and open. That's also there as well because of my own experiences, which is why I'm so willing to share stuff with others.
I think that's what makes a person an effective missionary is not that they've kind of arrived at the finish line. It's like, okay, I finished the race. Now I'm going to come back and help all the rest of y'all get to where I am right now. It's like, no, this is a journey. I'm in the midst of it. I'm getting wounded in the battlefield. I'm falling down. I'm getting up. But like, hey, we're in this whole thing together. And I think that authenticity is really what wins people's hearts. And so maybe share your story for those who aren't familiar with what you've been through. I mean, you mentioned, rehab and addiction, porn, all this stuff. Like, rewind back to the beginning. Like, were you raised in a Catholic home? When did the struggle start beginning? And kind of tell us your story. Have you wrestled in this area and found some victory?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a long story. I will keep it short, kind of hitting the main points. But I did grow up in a Catholic household, and I grew up very well aware of pornography, and maybe not what it was or what it had because I hadn't been exposed to it, but I was aware that God had given us a sexuality and it was designed a very specific way and for marriage. And most people are like, how did you know that? Well, we used to drive across Texas to visit my grandparents. My mom would put in these Christopher West Theology of the Body cassette tapes, and she had this big binder of cassette tapes of all his lectures. And I just remember being a young kid, and Mom would break out these tapes, and me and my siblings, oh gosh, Mom's breaking out the tapes, and we would force ourselves to fall asleep because we didn't want to listen to this guy go on and on about sex. But through that, I was very well aware that, like, even though I didn't know to what extent or the theology behind it, I knew God gave me a sexuality and it's made for a purpose, even though I wasn't sure what that was. I understood that much. And so when I first saw pornography, I was aware that I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing. But there was this excitement that was there, not just because I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, but because what I was seeing sort of awoke in this desire in me, right? This arousal that I wasn't aware was even there. And it was a very short process of first time exposure to being full blown addicted. Like, it happened much faster than anyone could have realized, and certainly that I could have realized. And it wasn't until I would say I was maybe 15 or 16 that I was like, okay, this is kind of a problem because I don't even like doing this thing. I don't want to do this thing, and yet I can't stop doing it. So within a few years, I think my first exposure was maybe 12 or 13. Within a few years, I was already completely addicted.
Now, the first exposure for you was that iPad, cell phone, laptop, just unsupervised internet access, and something popped up and then you dove in.
Yeah. So in a sense, I guess what started the ball was I was at school, and in the girl locker room, there was a magazine being passed around. Now, people might think porn magazine, but it wasn't. It was like Cosmo or Vogue or one of those girl magazines, but there was an article in it that was extremely detailed and graphic about certain sexual acts. And when I had read it, I remember thinking like, well, what is this? I wasn't aware of these things. And it kind of sparked this curiosity. So I sought out pornography on my own at home, but it kind of started by this exposure, I guess you could say. The thing about my house, though, was my mom was very well aware of like pornography and it existing. And so the computer was in a family room. Okay, it was not in a room that even had a door. It was like the front room, and the computer had a password. And so to get on the computer, you had to ask for permission first. Mom had to come type the password, and then you're exposed for everyone to see what you're doing, and the computer was facing other people. So it was extremely difficult to access pornography in that I had to wait until like nobody was around, and then someone could walk in at any moment and just kind of really being on my toes about it. But unfortunately for my mom, and she certainly tried, unfortunately for her, she wasn't as tech savvy as I was. It was very quick. I was a quick learner in like figuring out how to cover my tracks and delete histories and that sort of thing. So she couldn't catch on to what was going on.
So you were able to go for, I imagine, quite a while undetected. So your tracks were covered up. You were checking out all the stuff. And did there come a point where you got caught, and then that's kind of what put the brakes on, or it just came to a point of like, man, I want to say no to this stuff, but I just can't. I remember meeting a high school guy once, and he told me that he goes home from the school on Friday, and he watches 12 hours of porn on Saturday, watches 12 more hours on Sunday, and then just goes back to school. And I remember what he said to me. He said, I don't even enjoy it anymore. Like, it kind of disgusts me, but I don't even know how to function without it. And so for him, it had almost ceased to be this source of joy and pleasure, just a source of just slavery, that he just felt he was just bonded to this thing and didn't know how to find liberation. So it was liberation more forced upon you, like, hey, I caught you doing this and you're out of here if you don't want that? Or was it like just this point of desperation, or maybe something else in your case? It
was both. I would say it was absolutely both, because I was in that spot of, I don't even want to do this thing. I was staying up all night. At this point, I'm maybe 16 years old. My parents had gotten me a laptop for school, school purposes. But now I have infinite access. And, I very quickly spiraled because of that. And I found myself hours and hours and hours, and not even wanting to, but I didn't know how not to either. And I certainly felt trapped. So this is going on. My parents aren't aware that I'm having this pornography addiction. They just see me heavily addicted to the computer. They don't have the full picture. They see me on my laptop constantly. I have all these chat windows to these guys I'm talking to. I'm gaming. I'm doing these other things to them. And again, that was all kind of this front of what was really going on and why I really needed that laptop. So they suspected like I was addicted to technology, to this laptop. I remember my mom called me out on it at one point. She said, "You're just so addicted to that darn thing." And I remember it like it struck a nerve because I knew it was true, but I didn't know, like I couldn't look at her and say, "No, I'm not," because it was true. But at the same time, I didn't know how not to be and how to stop. And so I felt like I couldn't do anything about it. So I actually ran away. I packed up my laptop and I took off because I wasn't ready to face this thing that was so much bigger than I was and had a grip of me, like a death grip on me. And I eventually came back. And after I'd say a year of this kind of going on and on, where they're trying to help me manage my computer problem, right? So now they've taken away the internet, but I have to hook up to the Ethernet cable and I have to do it at the kitchen table. So they're trying to help me, and all the while it's still going on. And I left for work that day, and I'd left my computer open, and the chat boxes are going off, and my mom can hear this noise. She sits down to kind of see what's going on with the computer, and she sees these conversations with these men. She sees very explicit conversations. She then sees some images that were exchanged. And when I got home from work, my parents are sitting there at the kitchen table with my laptop, and my stomach just, I mean, it's in my throat, just that awful feeling of getting caught, of being busted. But they recognized that I had an issue. And now it's kind of like they saw the whole picture. Now they're like, oh, she's not just addicted to the computer. There's something else going on here. And they extended the offer. They're like, we want to help you. We can see that you're struggling and we don't know how to help you, but maybe there's someone out there who does know how to help you. And that's when they offered rehab. That's when they said, let's send you there so you can get the help you need.
Yeah, now the struggles that you were having, a lot of people, are just looking at pictures, looking at videos, but it hasn't taken on, in a sense, that third dimensional aspect where you're interacting with other human beings, which obviously when it comes to the point of running away and interacting with men online, it is such a toxic combo. I mean, that's where a lot of girls go missing and lost into sex trafficking. And, thanks be to God, it wasn't the case for you. But I imagine these conversations start in such a way where it feels benign. It's just like, oh, it's a little playful flirting, or this is just some connection I made, but it doesn't take long before it descends into some pretty morbid addictions that are kind of a false relationship that you're turning to for legitimate needs. And so I would imagine having those personal connections made it a lot harder to break free, because you weren't just breaking free from just this anonymous site. You were having to, in a sense, break off actual quasi-relationships.
Absolutely. And at that point, because I'd seen so much pornography, what I truly believed was, because this is what I saw on the screen, a woman is only good for how she can please a man sexually, or what she can do for a man sexually. And that's what I saw over and over again. And without even realizing it, it's a truth it's a lie, but it became my truth. It became a truth that I began to believe that, that's my value. And so all of these conversations took on a sexual nature because I felt like I had nothing else to offer. People weren't interested in me as a person. It was just, what can I do for them sexually? How can I please them? And keep in mind, I was a minor at this time, and I'm having conversations with grown men and, who have wife and kids and that sort of thing. But because this addiction already had a hold of me, it didn't matter what the consequences were. It didn't matter that I could ruin this man's marriage, or his kids might never talk to him again, or whatever, or his career is at stake. And for me, we're talking jail time because of the fact that I'm under 18. None of that mattered, because I fell into, I needed this validation. Because on the one hand, here's pornography, and it's making me hate myself. Okay, but I can talk to these men who somehow validate me. Yeah. And now I hate myself less because, well, they like me, so maybe I'm not so terrible after all. But then after the conversation ends and that's gone, now I hate myself again. So I'm going to turn back to pornography because that's going to make me feel better. And you can see this cycle. And so when it came time to stop, you're right, it was way harder, because now there's these men blowing up my phone, texting me, hey, where are you? You haven't been online recently. I had to change my number I think 13 times in that first year of sobriety. It was something like that. I kept having to change my cell phone number because I had to get away from these people, in addition to battling the pornography.
Yeah, analogy came to mind as you were talking about that. In a certain sense, the sexual value that you had was almost like it probably only felt like the only currency that you had to offer. I just got back from Mexico, and in some places you might want to buy something and they might not accept dollars, and the only thing they accept is pesos. So you could literally have $1 million in your pocket. You could have 1 billion yen or whatever, and shekels and this and that, all these different currencies, all this value and wealth. But unless you have the pesos, like, you can't enter into any financial exchange. And so I think when we're in this pornified culture, in a sense, a woman feels like, okay, my only currency, the only value I have to offer here is the pesos. It's the sexual value. And so I almost have to take all my other worth and kind of just dump it into this, because that's the only way I can have any interaction with other people. And so what they don't realize at the time is that the solution isn't to spend your life savings converting it into this currency and pouring it in just so you feel like you're getting something in return. But maybe you're in the wrong country altogether. Maybe you need to move the place that actually values the currency you have, your personality, your sense of humor, your spirituality, your talent, like all of these other values a woman possesses that become meaningless and valueless when you're living in a pornified culture that only wants you for one thing. And so that's the challenge, though, is kind of like uprooting yourself out of that culture and going into a culture that helps you to see that there's more that you have to offer than just your body. And so I imagine that's where kind of rehab stepped in at that point of like, okay, you are unable to be extradited from this country on your own. And so we are going to deport you and put you in a place where you can start to realize your worth. Is that kind of how that transition happened in your case?
Absolutely. That's the starting place. And I think it's always important when we talk about recovery to understand that there are, and I even hesitate to say starting place, because I think we tend to think of things linearly, like a line, right? Like we think of things like, oh, I start here and I end here. And so a lot of us, at least this was my hope, was that there would be an ending to the addiction. But I don't think it's like a line. I think of it more as like a web or almost a puzzle. Okay, so I need certain pieces in place to help me with this addiction that is probably for the rest of my life. And I say probably because maybe a cure will come out and I'll take this pill and everything will go away, but most likely it's not going to. And so I need to kind of understand that there are these puzzle pieces. So rehab was a piece. It was, here's a piece we're snapping into place for you. So now you can kind of see the overall picture and things are coming together into place a little bit better. The psychological aspect was very helpful to maybe go through some trauma, to understand some of the psychology behind it. And certainly the cold turkey, like we're going to get you away from a computer, away from your cell phone, away from all these things. I mean, they didn't even let us have sugar at this rehab place. So you had nothing to fall back on, no caffeine, no sugar. Like, yeah. And so it really was that starting point or that puzzle piece of, okay, here's how we can begin to look at the psychological aspect. But certainly I still needed the spiritual aspect. I needed spiritual healing. I needed the physical and the more tangible, practical pieces as well in place, tools to utilize once I came out. Because that's the thing about rehab. I went for 35 days of intensive care. And it was beautiful and it was wonderful. And so much work was done. And I came out and oh, guess what? Not only is everything just the way it was when I left, but it's even crazier. Like the internet is even faster and pornography is even more accessible. And so these things are now there in a way that's like, all right, that helped, but I can't live my life in a bubble. Now what? Now what does recovery look like?
Yeah. No, I love the fact that you're explaining this not as simply a linear approach of like, hey, I did this, I signed my chastity commitment card, I heard that great talk, and then life is totally different. But just the humility to acknowledge like, hey, this might persist for some time. And, I'm okay with that because this isn't just some like stunning one-time victory and then it doesn't come back. It's like, okay, there's a vulnerability there, and I think progressing in chastity isn't so much growing strength upon strength, but more a greater realization of your weakness. Mm-hmm. Because I think that in a sense is your strength. If you're able to see what your weakness is and hold that before God and others, and then you have that accountability and you realize, okay, I know if I go near that, I could very well slide back into years of just backsliding into some really bad habits. And so maybe I need to walk, a couple extra yards further away from that than maybe someone else would. But that realization of your weakness, I think, is what's allowed you to have that freedom. And the freedom isn't like an immunity. It's like, great, I'm not tempted anymore. It's like, no, it's a very real thing. This is a battle. And there's lots of different pieces that get put into place. I think a lot of parents think, okay, well, we got the filters, it's in there, it's good. It's like, well, no, yeah, that's super important, but it's almost like training wheels that you're putting on the side of a bike. Eventually you have to become your own filter. Eventually technology can't do that, can't replace your will. And so it's a very gradual training in human freedom that's accompanied by all these pieces, whether it's the rehab or this or that. And then I would imagine through rehab and family, you're able to kind of maybe to get down to some of the more core issues of like, what is it I'm craving when I turn to this? Am I turning this when I'm bored, when I'm angry, when I'm stressed, I'm lonely? Like, what's going on in my life? Were they able to help you kind of look at the kind of legitimate unmet needs that were maybe fueling the addiction?
Sure. That was definitely in place in rehab. And then afterwards, seeing a therapist and working on some of those things. That's extremely helpful. I will say this. Knowing all of that, though, was never enough to actually get me to stop watching pornography. Now, this is just my own experience. Maybe some people can say, oh, like in the heat of the moment, oh, I want to watch pornography because of this childhood wound. And what I'm really craving is the love of God. And so I'm not going to watch it. Like maybe some people that knowledge, it's kind of the self-knowledge is enough for them. But I do think that there's more work to be done. Again, I think that's a certain puzzle piece that is absolutely vital in understanding maybe what is it that I'm truly longing for. I think that's very helpful to understand, or that I wasn't disgusting or broken for having a sexual desire, that in fact God gave me that thing that I have hated my entire life. That's actually a beautiful gift. Those things are important. But at the end of the day, if I put all my chips on that, as soon as I understand this, or if I could just understand this trauma or why this thing happened to me, then I won't struggle with this thing. I'm not going to bank on that, because there's a very, very real chance that knowing that actually isn't going to save me or stop me from watching pornography. And that's just the reality of it. I think that's the reality of maybe any addiction. So again, very helpful puzzle piece. I strongly encourage people to look into that, but to not allow that to be the lifeline, because then what ended up happening for me is I got out of rehab, and it was not cheap, and it was a lot of work, and I relapsed, and it maybe went like a couple months or something like that, but I eventually relapsed. And I remember thinking well, gosh, if the top psychiatrists around the country couldn't save me, if knowing these things, if looking at my trauma wasn't enough to save me, then I'm a hopeless cause. I'm a lost cause. And there's no way I'm ever going to overcome this thing, because that didn't work. And it was really a dark place of despair, of thinking that I was unsavable.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you're keeping us all in suspense here. So if that wasn't the silver bullet, if that, that was an important piece, but what was the thing that finally was able to help you say, you know what? I know it's there. I know I can, but I won't. So for you and your own story, what was that thing?
Oh gosh. Well, I would say there's 1,000 silver bullets, right? In my recovery journey, there's so many different things that did it for me at that time or in that moment. So it eventually led to a suicide attempt. My pornography addiction was so severe. I mean, I'm talking, I would watch it like almost 15 times a day. It was nonstop from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, if I even went to sleep, because I would also stay up all night watching it. It was just this constant thing, and I couldn't keep up, and I felt like I would never break free. And no matter how many times I went to confession, no matter how many times I said I'm never going to do it again, or how many computers I got rid of and the filters and all the things, I inevitably would fall again. And each time I felt like I fell further and further. And it seemed that the only way to make it all stop would to just not be alive. Because if this was the life I was going to live, if this is what my life was going to look like, I don't know that it was worth living, because I was miserable. I was absolutely miserable in it. And that suicide attempt, although it wasn't a silver bullet, what it showed me was that this addiction of mine is life or death. That's what it is. For so long, I was treating it as like this problem I have, or this bad habit, or this thing that I struggle with. But it was so consuming. I had to realize the severity of it. Realizing that my life was at stake made this thing, it meant that addressing this thing was life or death as well. Mm-hmm. So if it's going to kill me, I've got to be willing to do whatever it takes to stop it. And again, for so long, I wanted to just treat it as a small issue. So for example, I didn't want to put a filter on my computer because other people don't have to have a filter on their computer. Why should I have to do that? And there was this like entitlement, like, oh, well, it's not fair. Like other people don't struggle with this. Or this pride that thought, well, I could figure it out. I could stop if I really wanted to. But I had to recognize I could not save myself. I could not, because if I could have, I would have, and I couldn't. So recognizing just how big this problem was a huge puzzle piece for me of saying, no, this is life or death. And if something's going to kill me, then guess what? Maybe a filter on my phone isn't so bad. Or if something's going to kill me, guess what? Maybe not having a computer in my room is no big deal. Because what do I get in exchange for that? My life? Okay, yeah, like I'll make that exchange.
Okay, so you were able to draw upon that at those moments, after that attempt of being like, you know what? I can live without this. In fact, the only way I can live is without this. I've noticed in my ministry on the topic of chastity, how amazing it is that how closely love is tied to life and lust is tied to death. It's almost as these two things are inextricably bound by nature itself. There's some ontological connection. You look at the fertility rites and cults of the Old Testament. A lot of these false gods were sacrificing the children, but they were also doing these, gravely sexually immoral things within their satanic liturgies. There's always that lust, and then there's the sacrifice. Today we've got the promiscuity tied to abortion, which is also tied to self-hatred and cutting and depression and suicide. That lust is very much tied to death, just as love by its very nature is life-giving. And so I think you just kind of came face to face with this reality of the father of lies promising you life by doing these things, promising you joy, freedom, intimacy, all these things. And then you pass through that veil into this incredibly dark place. And like, wait, this whole thing is a sham. This whole thing is a counterfeit. That's just going to end not just with me looking at some racy website. This is going to end with me in my grave. And so that wake-up call, so essentially drawing upon that realization is what was able to make you, the next time you were in front of that screen, nobody was around, you to be able to say, you know what, this just isn't worth it. And so for you, was that the thing that was just able to click it off, minimize the window, and stayed clean as much as you could?
Gosh, I mean, we all long for that moment of just minimizing the window and walk away. But I think early on in recovery, it was a lot more of like, no, I need an entire system put in place, because I don't have that ability. And maybe here's the thing. Maybe I did have it somewhere deep down inside of me, but I didn't want to test that theory, because if I didn't, then it meant I was back watching pornography again. So I kind of erred on the side of caution. I acknowledge, and you hit on it earlier about weakness. I had to accept my weakness. I had to accept that I couldn't do this thing on my own. I had to accept that only God himself could save me from this thing. This thing was so much bigger than me. It was, pornography was richer than I was, faster, smarter, everywhere. Like it was all the things that I wasn't. And I had to recognize that. And I had to say, okay, well, who is bigger than $1 billion industry, right? Who's bigger than that? God? Okay, then I'm going to put God head to head with pornography. I'm going to put God against pornography because I can't fight this thing anymore. So this moment of near death, this near death experience, I would love to say that. And then I never watched pornography again, right? I love the idea of that. And I think that's just my addict brain that not only wants the quick hit and the quick high, I want the quick fix as well. Okay, well, if I'm not going to be an addict, I want to be, cured instantly. Yeah. But unfortunately, that has not been my case. And so I have to surrender, and I had to say, okay, Lord, if this thing's going to kill me, I need you to help me, because I'm dying here. I would say not only was I dying, I was already dead in it. It was a slow, painful death of being dead. I was not in any way who I was. I was unrecognizable to myself. Other people were dead to me. Everyone just became objects. And if I didn't have a way to use them, I didn't need them in my life. It was just, I had no drive, no motivation, no passion. And so in this death, I was able to recognize I've got to accept defeat. that I can't anymore. And if I can't, like, I have to let him in. I have to let him do this. So I did put certain things in place. Things had to change. I remember when I was in rehab, they used to say, when nothing changes, nothing changes. And I hated that slogan because I was like, what does that even mean? But at this point, I understood it, that if I kept doing what I always did, I would get what I always got. So things had to change. As much as I didn't want to switch to a dumb phone, I had to. Why? Because my life was at stake. Why? Because this thing had me licked, because I could not overcome this on my own. And those things in place, I think, are the beginning, or again, another puzzle piece. Because still, we all know that you can get past filters, or eventually I could find my way to somehow view pornography. So what's that other piece then? Again, it's that surrender. It's that surrender to God to say, look, I don't know why I struggle with this thing. I don't know why I have to carry this cross. I certainly, at 12 years old, was not expecting a lifelong battle with this thing. None of us who struggle with pornography addiction signed up for this. No, I don't know anyone who's like, man, I really want this thing to destroy my marriage, destroy my career, and consume me in every way possible, and kill my soul in the process. None of us wanted this. And God knows that more than I think I even knew that. So turning that over to him and saying, how about I just surrender each day and I carry my cross, and whatever that looks like today is what I'm going to accept. And so some days the temptations might be more brutal than other days. And that's okay, because this is my daily cross, and I surrender every day, and it brings me to my knees every day, and I turn it over to God because I don't know how I'm going to handle it, but I know that he does.
Yeah, I think so often the point that we think where we're losing God is the place where he's encountering us most in our life. And sometimes it's an addiction, sometimes it's a wound, suffering that won't go away. You know, it's kind of like that St. Paul attitude. You know, I begged the Lord 3 times to remove this thorn, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so for some people, I think that point might be an addiction, a sin that they can't overcome. For someone, it might be a vocational struggle of like, look, I want to get married, I want to have kids, but there's no decent person within sight, or other people, whatever it is, that point of suffering that just doesn't seem to go away. God has allowed that in our lives for a reason. And I think sometimes he lets us fumble in our sins of maybe lust or whatever, to develop in us a more important virtue of humility. Because humility being the foundation stone of all of the rest of the virtues, the devil, I think, would gladly let us become pure if he could build up in us this dictatorship of pride. Because, you can become pure as an angel, but if I can make you proud, I'm going to win. And God knows, well, this soul could struggle with temptation and lust for a long time, but if I can build up them the virtue of humility, then all else is going to be won. And so we might
because if God had healed me in that instant, which he could have, right, and he can, I have no doubt that my own pride would have eventually gotten to me at some point. And I would have said, I don't need God. Like, remember that pornography thing I struggled with? I got this thing figured out. I haven't struggled with it ever since then. And because it's still a weakness of mine, it humbles me and it keeps me on my knees. And every day I turn to him, and that surrender is the path to holiness, because of that humility of saying, I don't have this thing figured out. My goodness, I can't even minimize a window on my computer. That's how weak I am. And in my weakness, I can turn to the Lord and say, then you be my strength. In my weakness, you come through and you help me be strong. Yeah. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we don't get a say in what our path to holiness looks like. I want my path to holiness to not have pornography in it. I want it to look completely different. I want it to look like Therese of Lisieux's life, right? Like, I just want to sit in a convent and pray. But guess what? The Lord has called me to be married and have kids now. And I still have these addictions, these things that I'm overcoming. And I have to be okay and surrender to that path of holiness. This is what he's chosen for me. And if pornography is the thing that makes me a saint, then I should be praising the Lord for it. I should be thanking him for this, because now I have something in my life that humbles me and knocks me off my feet and brings me to my knees every day and gives me the opportunity to turn to him. If I didn't have this, where would all my opportunities be? I'd have to find them elsewhere, because this certainly has provided that for me.
Yeah, and what you say, I mean, it's shocking and beautiful to say, wait, pornography make you a saint? No. Pornography is going to send you to hell. It's like, no. Understand this properly. It's kind of what Bishop Olmsted said once in an address he gave to men. I remember he was the bishop, just retired here in Phoenix, amazing saintly bishop. And he said, imagine at the end of the time when all the saints are assembled together, and all the different crowns and battles that everybody have fought, that a lot of the saints of ages past will look at the saints who will rise up at this time and be like, yeah, we had our battles in our day, but those are the ones over there who fought the beast up close in a unique way. And so God is raising up saints in the midst of these battles and temptations. And, God sends you out even in the midst of struggling with this stuff. I read a priest yesterday had this little note, and he said one of his professors in seminary told them in class, don't confuse enthusiasm for a virtue with the acquisition of that virtue. And I was like, oh, that's rich. Like, we get so easily say, I want to preach on love. I want to preach on chastity. I want to preach on, and you get enthusiastic about preaching this particular virtue. And it almost gives you the sense, well, I'm so excited about this, I must have it. And God's like, no. Just because you're pumped up about talking about something doesn't mean you've acquired that virtue. But I think what he does, because he wants us to live authentically, is to call us into those mission fields, to say, look, I want you to speak on this. I want you to talk on this. I want you to proclaim this, even though you're not perfect at forgiving and mercy and love and patience and all this stuff, because I want to be ministering to you through your ministry. And so did you find that happened in your own life when he called you into mission work, when you weren't all squeaky clean?
Yes, certainly it happened then. And I have a story to go with that is when I got to Texas State University as a campus minister, I remember I was there for 1 week, okay? And in the course of 1 week, I had 5 different girls from the Catholic Student Center come into my office at different times and just kind of close the door and hey, can we talk? And just kind of confide in me their struggles with pornography and masturbation. I had 5 different girls in 1 week. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh gosh, like the Lord wants me to do something. Like surely this, is not a coincidence. And he's putting these girls in front of me. But I remember this, I had this little voice in the back of my head saying, well, you can't do anything because you still struggle with this issue yourself. And so you need to just ignore this. And I remember I thought, okay, wait. If everyone's a sinner and all the saints were sinners, right, and we all allowed our sin to prevent us from doing ministry or from spreading the gospel, then no one would be qualified. None of us would ever be able to qualify to preach on the saving message of our Lord because, well, we're all still broken, all of us. And so I was like, okay, I can't let that stop me. So we started a support group. And in that, there can be this openness, this honesty of like, look, I don't have this thing entirely figured out either, but you know what? I'm going to rub elbows with you and I'm going to be right next to you, pushing back and fighting this thing together and have this solidarity. And the reason I'm so passionate about speaking and particularly when we're in our struggles is because rewind, I would say, 8 years before that, I was doing ministry in South Louisiana. I was at a parish. I was doing youth ministry. And there was a kid there who was very, very, very much struggling with pornography addiction. And at the time, although we were talking about theology of the body, none of us, and myself included, opened up about our own struggles with pornography or lust or, regarding this matter. We all just kind of said, here's what the church teaches. And he later ended up getting caught with what he was doing. And it was some of the stuff that I did when I was in a teenager. And he got sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison.
Wow.
Now, I currently write him to this day. I've been writing him for about 5 years now. He still has a long time to go in his sentence. But one of the things he said in one of my letters in our exchanges is he said, I just can't help but think that if someone had opened up about their struggles, I would have opened up about mine. He's like,
wow.
I really looked up to you guys. I loved what y'all were saying, but I felt totally alone in it. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I had no one to go to. Now, this hits me really hard because I knew at the time I was definitely struggling with this issue. But again, there was this thought of like, well, I can't tell people I'm struggling because I'm also telling them not to do this thing that I'm doing. Or like I'm the face of this church or this youth group and people can't know that I'm also broken. And that's just a lie of the devil. It's a lie of the devil. And now this kid, he could have maybe stopped. Who knows? I mean, there's no saying. But perhaps that was the ticket out for him, was that authenticity, that honesty. Maybe that would have been enough for him to say, hey, I'm going to open up and hey, I'm going to get help too. This is why it's imperative, because this disease in particular, this addiction, thrives in secrecy. Mm-hmm. Secrecy and shame is where this thing festers and it grows and it becomes this thing that is all consuming. And it's like, no, but I have to keep it a secret. No one can know. And ever since him, I've been like, no, anytime someone asks, anytime I speak about it, I'm going to be as open as I can because people need to know. We've got to start talking about this. And not because it's like, oh, you're not alone and we're all in this together. Because I told Matt Fradd when we had interviewed, I mentioned to him, I said, look, I was dying in my pornography addiction. And so knowing that other people were struggling too didn't necessarily make me feel better, because it's like, imagine like a cancer patient who's dying of cancer, like, oh, well, there's other people dying of cancer too. You're not alone. Like, okay, well, I'm still dying,
Yeah.
like, help me out here. But what it does is it gives us this outstretched hand that we can grab onto and say, okay, I'm not alone. Now what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
I think it has to be both. It's recognizing other people are in it too, but then there has to be this action instead of just, well, you're not alone. That's consoling. Okay, well, maybe for a second it's consoling, but now what? Now what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we overcome this thing that is killing us?
Yeah, I think the last thing a person really needs when they're in the midst of all these struggles is kind of like a know-it-all Christian, of just like, hey, here's all the strategies, here's all the techniques, here you go, implement that, you're good to go. It's like, okay, great. And then you try a couple of them, you burn out, and then you fall on your face, because what you really wanted was someone who didn't have all the answers. You wanted someone who could ask questions with you and be like, struggle together and just walk alongside. And like, I don't need someone in front of me just walking ahead. I need someone kind of walking beside me, of just like, okay,
Yes.
we're in the same, how you doing? Not so good. How you doing? I'm doing really bad. Like, sometimes just the vulnerability goes so much further. But before we wrap things up, maybe a little input from you would be helpful on how has this impacted your own vocation? The discernment of your vocation, the practice of your vocation, because a lot of people think, oh, marriage will take care of that, or the convent will take care of that. Oh, if I just go into religious life, then all that stuff's going to go away because I'm not going to have an iPad in my cell or whatever. But like, a lot of people think vocation is a cure to all this stuff, when it's like, no, sometimes a vocation can just be a really nice fancy rug for all this stuff to hide underneath. But So how has this impacted your discernment in the living out of your vocation?
Yeah, so as someone who has kind of lived a little bit of both vocations, and what I mean by that is I did spend some time in the convent prior to getting married. As someone who's kind of dipped my foot into both, I will say to not put that on anything. Certainly not a vocation, but like, just that there's nothing out there that it's like, this is the ticket to help me. And as soon as I have this thing, as soon as I have this job, as soon as I move to this city, as soon as I meet my wife, then I will never struggle with pornography again. Oh, it's just because I'm lonely. If I had a spouse there next to me, I wouldn't do this thing. Okay. When I got married, it began to crop up, and I thought, oh no, like, now what does this look like in a marriage? My entire life, I've had to navigate this addiction alone. But now what does it look like that there's this other person with me? And I remember I was very open and honest with my spouse before we got married. As we were dating, I let him know that this was an issue. And I remember the first time I slept with pornography after we were married, and I went to him right away. That was a big part of what we discussed, was our game plan, was what happens, not necessarily if I slip, but when. And a big part was go to him and just be honest about it. And I remember the first time I opened it, I mean, I'm a hot mess. I'm crying my eyes out. I can barely get it out in confessing what I had done. And he looked at me and he said, remember, he's like, we're married. There's two of us now. He's like, you don't have to fight this thing alone. I'm going to fight this thing with you. Your battle, your struggle is now my struggle as well. And I remember him saying that and just being like blown away, because what that was Christ saying that as well. And I had a spouse to be the image of Christ to me in that moment. But I think even for people who aren't married or who are thinking that marriage will do this, to just remember that it is Christ who says to us, like, this battle of yours is also going to be my battle. Now there are practical things we can do in our marriage to help with this thing. But at the end of the day, to remember that, like, the Lord is in it with us. So like, when it crops up, to know that like Christ is right there, that he's never left, that like the shame thing is, I think, how the devil gets us, right? Because now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm even worse now because this is infidelity. Like, I cheated on my husband by watching pornography. That's one of the 10 commandments. Like, you can really spiral with the shame in that regard. But to just run to Christ immediately, run to your spouse and to seek that forgiveness, but But a part of seeking that is to snap out of that shame right away, because then that shame, again, leads me into more secrecy. Oh, I better not tell my husband I slipped. Like, there's no, like, oh, I just feel awful. And then if I've already slipped, then it's like, well, he doesn't know about that time, so maybe I'll watch it again. And, well, I can't get to confession, so maybe I'll watch it. And that spiral, again, of secrecy and shame can just lead me back to where I was, back to death. So, yes, navigating that dream of marriage is, again, something that I'm still unpacking. Now, it's been a few years since I've watched pornography, and that's by the grace of God alone, and it's by taking it one day at a time. But through that, there's been all sorts of ups and downs of, okay, this doesn't work. Now what do we do? Okay, I need filters back on my computer. Okay, let's not have my laptop in the room. Okay, so each time I'm learning, because as we journey in life, our environment changes and our temperament changes, our mood changes, just maybe how much we're working, how much we're eating, and to just be open to like, okay, now what does recovery look like? Yes, when I was single, that worked for me, but that doesn't work now. So now what do I do? And instead of having judgment of saying, oh no, that thing that always worked never works now I'm hopeless. It's never, like, get out of that spiral and just say, okay, that no longer works. What can we put in place instead?
No, your witness is so powerful, I think, to a lot of people listening, just because it's just so real. I mean, so often we just get to see people when they've crossed the finish line. It's like, okay, they got it all together, but the fact that you're like, yep, it's looming there in the background. We've made some progress. We still got some work to do. And just the fact that you're able to pour this stuff out to God, pour this stuff out to your spouse, even when you're just a total hot mess, and just be like, here you go. And I think people need to hear that God receives that. Like, we don't need to have all our junk together. Then we can come to God. When we were this last week at Our Lady of Guadalupe, I was explaining the tilma to the pilgrims, because there's, obviously a lot of people know the symbolism behind the tilma, which is the image, for those who might not be familiar, that was divinely imprinted upon a garment that St. Juan Diego was wearing that ended up converting. It's an image of Our Lady, and it triggered the conversion of about 9 million indigenous people in a span of about 10 years to Catholicism, seeing the beauty of this image. And there's the dyes on it aren't from anything on earth. They can't be replicated. The stars on Our Lady's tilma are arranged as the way they were in the constellation in the sky on the day that the apparition happened in the 1500s. I mean, there's so many miraculous things about this. But the point I want to draw out that I was talking to the pilgrims about, I was like, if you look over here, it looks like the color's kind of flaking off. And if you look over here, it looks like this is kind of fading. But over here, it's like vibrant and still perfect. What gives? And I was explaining to them that over the years, Mexican Catholics have actually painted on top of parts of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so if you see the gold flares of the sunlight going out behind her, that's kind of flaking off. Well, that's gold leafing that they added on top of the original imagery. And it's originally it was kind of white. They wanted to make it gold. If you look at a line at Our Lady's forehead, it's where they had previously painted a crown on top of the tilma, and they decided they want to get rid of it. You look at the angel's wings, they painted the wings the colors of the Mexican flag, and Mary just kind of went along with it all. But what's interesting is in the 1920s, someone put a bomb in front of the tilma. It went off, it exploded, it burst the altar into like gravel. There was a bronze cross there that was bent like a twig in the wind. But the tilma just had a thin sheet of glass in front of it. The glass wasn't even cracked, although the stained glass windows throughout the church were burst out. Like a hand of God had protected it. Someone spilled acid on it in the 1790s, but nothing happened to the tilma. It's made of cactus fibers that should rot in 20 years, but it's 500 years old. And so God preserved it from all of that, but then God lets his kids paint all over the thing. We wanted this, wanted that. But isn't that God, though? Isn't that what a mother does? Doesn't her mother let her kids put makeup on her? I mean, I let my daughters put makeup on me. They're like, Dad, we want to do a makeover. Like, what? I sit on the couch and mascara, there's blush, there's braids, there's earrings. I mean, I look like I got mugged when they're done with me. But that's what the parent does. It lets the kid bring the mess to the parent and just let you do your thing. And so the beauty of your witness to me is the fact that you've just brought your mess out in front of all these listeners you don't know, in front of God, in front of your husband. And I think that's why, God is going to bless your message. He's going to bless you. He's going to bless your family, of just the authenticity. So as we wrap up, is there anything that you'd want to share in terms of resources you think people need to get plugged into, how they could connect with you, just for someone struggling in the trenches, guy or girl, just being like, okay, I'm in the midst of this mess. I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. I'm getting really depressed because I've tried 500 things and I keep messing up. Any last words of encouragement or resources you want to point out before we close?
Yeah, I mean, certainly to the people who are in the struggle, there is absolutely nothing I can say right now that would make the reality of your situation any less painful than it already is. And so I see you. I see you in the pain and in the suffering. And I just like my heart breaks. My heart breaks because I remember that feeling, and I don't ever want to forget that feeling, because that feeling is what reminds me every day that like I need to turn to the Lord with this thing, because it's so much bigger and so much more powerful than me. But that there is hope. There's hope that the Lord not only wants to restore you, but he wants to bring about his glory through you. And I know when you're in it, it seems like there's no way God's glory could shine through this thing that you have going on, this awful secret that you're hiding from people. But you can look at people like me, who's sharing my story, and suddenly you see this kind of glory, even if it's just a flicker of it coming through, and you say like, wow, like she is now glorifying God through that thing that was so awful, that almost killed me, right? That thing that was destroying my life. Like there's a beauty that's there now. Why? Is it because I haven't figured out? No. It is because I am turning it over to God every day, and I'm allowing him to do what he does best, and that's be God. And in that surrender, here comes the glory. Here comes the glory when I get out of the way, when I surrender. I will say I did create an email address if someone does want to reach out, if they just need a listening ear, if they just need someone to kind of hear their story. I created an email address when I interviewed on the Victory podcast. So it's Victory and then my name, Breanne, BREANNE @gmail.com. Victory Breanne @gmail.com. You can send me a message. I will get back to you. I promise. It might be a couple of days because I have 2 little babies, but I will get back to you, and I want you to know that I will listen. I will hear you, and I'm here to support you, and certainly pray for you in the meantime, because it's tough. It's tough, and we might not all have the support out there, but definitely if you're able to find some sort of support group, maybe sometimes it's a 12-step group, sometimes it's a group at church, sometimes it's just another person. When we say group, I think sometimes we think we need like a ton of people on board. One person that you can be open and honest with and vulnerable. And even if they don't struggle with the same thing, it's just someone who can hear you and not have judgment, because what that'll teach you is how to not have judgment on yourself as well. When you see that other person, that's what happened to me when I told my husband, hey, I slipped up with pornography. He looked at me and he loved me and he said, this is our battle now, and I'm going to help you, and we're going to get through this together. Instead of being like, I can't believe you slipped up, go to your room, or I don't know what he would have said to me, like, don't talk to me. There wasn't any of that judgment. And so it helped me to see Christ in that moment, but then to not have that judgment on myself. And I think it is helpful when we reach out to others, gets us out of that isolation and that secrecy.
And I'll put your email in the show notes. So if someone doesn't remember it, I'll put it there so they can click on it. I'll also put in the show notes the link again to Canopy. And so that's the app I mentioned at the top of the show that's able to block pornographic content. And you get 15% off if you use that code 15OFF. I'll put that down in the show notes. And then also I'll have a link down there to Patreon. I had mentioned at the top of the show the new book we just came out on gender. If you want to get the audiobook or ebook, or pre-order the book, you can do it at chastity.com. Or if you want it for free, you can become a supporter on our Patreon account there for $20 per month. We'll send you one for free, and then you help support the show. So, Breanne, I can't thank you enough for your authentic witness, for being able to come on the show, your vulnerability and honesty. Keep up the God work, and God bless you and your family, especially this Christmas.
Thank you so much.